Literature is a rich source of language for our English language students. The universal themes, emotions, and messages speak to students of all ages and all backgrounds. In order to make literature more accessible to students of different English language proficiencies, major and specialty publishers have created graded readers. Graded readers take works of literature and also works of nonfiction and preserve the plot, the settings, and the stories and the information, but present these with simplified grammar and simplified vocabulary. In this session, we'll look at different activities to use with both literature and graded readers so that our students complete more extensive reading both in class and outside of class. We'll start the session by defining intensive reading and extensive reading, the two types of reading that we want to do with our students. We'll look at using literature to teach reading and using graded readers to teach reading. We'll take you through criteria to keep in mind when you're selecting the literature or graded readers that you want to use. We'll also look at sources for graded readers or where to buy them. Finally, we'll take a look at different activities to use with both literature and graded readers to teach your students reading. Let's get started. In order for students to develop both their English language proficiency and their English reading skills, we need to make sure that they have the opportunity to do two types of reading. These are intensive reading and extensive reading. Intensive reading is when students spend a lot of time looking at the reading text in great detail. So they read the text both for content and for language. So they're going to work at understanding all of the content details, the vocabulary, and the different grammatical structures. Intensive reading is usually done together as a class. So all of the students in the class are reading the same reading text at the same time. Extensive reading, on the other hand, is reading that students do for enjoyment or pleasure. For extensive reading, we let the students select their own books. So students select books based on their own personal interests. And students read for a big picture view of the reading text. So they're reading for the characters and the plot and the settings and just for the enjoyment of immersing themselves in that reading experience. They don't spend a lot of time or any time at all looking up words in the dictionary or analyzing grammatical structures. Extensive reading can be completed in class or at home. And remember, with extensive reading, students are probably reading different books, so no two students are reading the same book at the same time. We want our students to do both intensive reading and extensive reading. With intensive reading, they really develop their accuracy, so they learn in detail what words mean, and they learn when different grammatical structures are used, once again in detail. With extensive reading, our students work on their fluency skills, so they learn how to read much more quickly and with much less effort. So both of these types of reading should be included in your reading lessons. Literature is defined as written material, such as poetry, novels, and essays, that capture enduring and memorable themes of human existence. They're considered to be artistic writings that are worth remembering. Literature touches upon these themes such as love, family, loss, and longing. This is what makes literature so memorable. Not only is it well written, but every human being reading these stories can relate to them. Here are some examples of literature that can be used in the English language classroom. Pride and Prejudice, The Little House on the Prairie books, any of the works by Edgar Allan Poe, books like The Three Musketeers, Swiss Family Robinson, and Mark Twain's works such as Tom Sawyer. These are just examples, and these are enduring tales, as we've said, that all of your students can relate to, and they're really fun to read as well. Using literary works or literature in their pure form can actually be challenging for students, particularly if they're of a lower language proficiency. So these challenges include the fact that the vocabulary might simply be too difficult, the grammatical structures might be too difficult. The vocabulary may be dated, so the vocabulary may only have been used in a particular era of English language usage rather than currently. The literary works might be too long for your students. And finally, the writing style may be too complex or too difficult to understand. There are ways around these challenges, however, and we'll look at these in the next section. A solution to the problem that literature may present to English language students because of the complexity of the language in the works is to use graded readers. Graded readers are readers that preserve the essence of a literary work, so the story and the plot and the characters and the settings, but adapt the language into a simplified form. Graded readers then make these wonderful stories from literature, and actually also nonfiction, accessible to English language students of different language proficiencies. There are both major publishers and specialized publishers that produce graded readers. Here are some of the ways that publishers simplify the language that is found in literary works to make it more accessible to different language proficiency levels. So the publishers will simplify the grammar, they'll shorten the sentences, they'll simplify the vocabulary, they'll make sure that the vocabulary is current, so they'll use up-to-date words rather than dated words. They'll introduce more white space so it's easier to read. They might actually even make the text or the font bigger. They'll introduce more illustrations so that there's more visual support for the story. And they'll make the document or the overall length of the work shorter. There are a lot of advantages to using graded readers that help you address the challenges of literature that we spoke about previously. Some of these advantages include students have access to written work that's accessible for their particular language proficiency level. Because of this, students can have an enjoyable and a successful reading experience. When students have a successful reading experience, they are then more motivated to read more and more on their own. Graded readers also help students learn more independently. Because the language in graded readers is adapted, students are not dependent either on the teacher or upon dictionaries or grammar reference books in order to understand what's going on in the story. Regardless of whether you choose to use literature in its original form with your students or have them work with an adapted form as a graded reader, there are certain criteria to keep in mind when selecting the stories that students will work with. Alternatively, if students are selecting the works themselves, you can coach them using these criteria to select readers that are appropriate for them. The work selected should be age appropriate. So it should be written for adults and read by adults, or written for kids and read by kids. It should also be appropriate in terms of student interest, both in terms of the content and the genre. And by genre, I mean whether it's a mystery story or an adventure story or a romance. The work selected should also be appropriate in terms of vocabulary content and vocabulary level. It should also be appropriate in terms of its grammatical complexity or its grammar level. It should be appropriate in terms of length. And finally, there should be an appropriate ratio of text to illustrations, both for the student background and student language proficiency level. Most major publishers in the English language teaching and learning field now publish graded readers, either through a separate division or through their own label. There are also a number of specialty publishers who focus only on producing graded readers and literature. In Activity 5 on your handout, we've given you a list of these publishers so that you can source out really good graded readers and literature for your students to use. When we use literature and graded readers with our students, we want to ask and answer 3 key questions through our activity choices. First of all, do we know that students are actually completing the reading? Second of all, do we know students are understanding the reading? And thirdly, are students benefiting from the overall reading experience? So each of our activities should somehow address one or more of these questions. The great thing about graded readers is that publishers provide a wide range of support materials on their websites. These support materials include study guides, workbooks, student activities, entire lesson plans for teachers to use, and quizzes. So these support materials should be your starting point when you're planning lessons around graded readers. There are other activities you can use, however, in addition to these support materials. So let's take a look at some of these. We'll divide the activity suggestions we have for you into three main categories: pre-reading activities, reading activities, and post-reading activities. And some of these activities are for intensive reading and some are for extensive reading, and we'll point out which are which as we go. So let's take a look at some activities you can use with both literature and graded readers. A commonly used pre-reading activity for literature and graded readers is prediction. We can have the students do predictions based on a lot of different information provided by the literature or graded readers. So they can predict the story based on the cover, based on information on the back cover, based on the book title. They can flip through the illustrations in the book and try and predict the story from there. They can also look at the chapter titles and predict the story. So there's a lot of good prediction type activities that you can do. Another interesting pre-reading activity is to have students research the author. So have students go online to look up when the author was born, if he or she is no longer living, when did he or she die, and what are some key points in the author's life story that might have shaped their work as an author. Students can either then share this information in small groups, or they can write a brief biography of the author. For the next pre-reading activity, put the titles of the chapters on individual strips of paper and make one set of titles for each small group in your class. Students then work together with their small groups to put the chapter titles in the correct order to try and predict how the book is going to unfold. And then you can confirm the answers as a class. The next pre-reading activity is another prediction activity. Have students read very quickly just the first chapter of the book. Then they have to either work individually or in a pair or small group to predict what's going to happen throughout the rest of the entire book. So what's the rest of the story that goes with this first chapter? They can either just talk about it or they can actually write points or write a brief paragraph about their predictions. The next pre-reading activity is another prediction one as well. Once again, students just very quickly read the first chapter of the book, but then they make predictions just about the next chapter. They're not predicting the entire book, they're just predicting one chapter ahead. These pre-reading activities help prepare students for their reading experience. These activities can be used for both intensive reading and extensive reading because they're simply laying the groundwork for the overall reading experience. Let's move on to actual reading activities, some of which will be intensive and some of which will be extensive. An extensive reading activity is simply to have the students read the entire book at their own pace, and they're reading it for the main idea. And with a book, the main idea includes who the characters are, what the setting is, what the themes are, and then what are the main elements of the plot. So this is an extensive reading activity. Students simply read the book to find out what the story is. Students can also read the book for detailed comprehension. And these are activities that are intensive reading activities. So students are really reading and rereading to get the most out of the language and the content presented in the book. The first activity for detailed comprehension is creating a character chart. So students create a chart in their books with the character names at the top, and then under each character, they fill in information that they find out about the character as they work through the book. So the character chart is completed throughout the whole reading process as more and more detail and information about the character is revealed. Likewise, we can have students create a detailed timeline or plot line. So students simply make a line, preferably on a big piece of paper like a legal-sized piece of paper. And then as they read, they fill in the main events. So they indicate the date and the time of the event, and then just a brief description of that event and maybe why it's important. So as they read, they're gradually building this plot line or timeline as the story unfolds. You can also have students write a detailed description of the setting, and this is a really good activity if the setting is really important in the book or if the setting changes. So they write down a description of the setting either in paragraph form or point form. If there's 2 or more settings, they can have 1 paragraph about each setting with which to compare and contrast those settings and the significance of the settings. You can have students write a detailed description of the theme or themes that are presented in the book. So as the story unfolds, have students take note of the main themes that they're seeing, and then also have them note the events or the ideas that back up or support or reveal those themes. A final detailed comprehension activity is to have students complete a descriptive book report. So as they go, students are making notes about the characters, the settings, the themes, and the plot. They then put this into a formal descriptive report of the story. Another type of reading activity is to have students read for language. This is another set of intensive reading activities. So students are reading and taking note of the language that the author uses to convey the story. The first activity you can have students do to read for language is to have them create a vocabulary list, kind of like a mini dictionary, for the book. So as they read and encounter new and interesting words, they write the words in the list, look them up in the dictionary, and then write that definition in their mini dictionary for the book. Another simple activity under Reading for Language is to have students complete vocabulary comprehension questions or just quick vocabulary quizzes that cover the words they've encountered in the book. An activity that focuses on the grammar level of Reading for Language is to have students read the text and identify different grammatical structures that they encounter. So for example, you could have them read a short chapter and identify all of the uses of the simple past. They then have to figure out how those simple past forms are made and why the author uses them in that particular situation. Finally, you can have students read and try to identify the underlying structure of the entire novel. So this is reading the novel from the discourse level. So in a big picture, how is this novel put together? So here you can go through the different elements of a plot and figure out what type of plot it is. So is it a mystery, or is it a tragedy, or is it a comedy? And then in this type of plot at the discourse level, what happens as the story unfolds? We use post-reading activities to give our students the opportunity to process and personalize the stories that they've read. So post-reading activities ask students to relate what they've read to their own personal experiences. Or these activities might ask students to be creative. If they had to put an ending on the story or a different ending on the story, what would they do? Or what happens next? So post-reading activities are usually used with extensive reading because students have read the stories for pleasure and now they're just processing them at a personal level. You can have students answer a series of questions that ask them to relate what they've read to their own personal experiences. So students might answer questions such as, which character in this story do you most relate to and why? Or, what events in this story are similar to events that you've had happen in your life? Personalization is a very powerful learning tool because it connects the students to what they've read. You can have students keep a reading journal. So they note down the date and time at which they read which part of the book. So chapter 1 was read on such and such date. And then they write down their personal reaction to what they have read. And it's the personal reaction part that's the most important. So students respond emotionally and personally to the story that they're reading. You can have students write a book review. So this is different from the book report. The book report simply had students describe the book in terms of the character and plot and so on. A book review actually asks students their opinion about what they've read. So they're rating the book on a scale of 1 to 5, for example, and supporting their opinion with concrete examples from the text. Now we get into activities that really tap into student creativity. As the first of these, you can have students write a script and then actually film the script of a part of the story or an event from the story. So they try to bring the story to life through video. You can have students work individually or in small groups to create a poster that is going to advertise a film that is based on the book. You can have students complete a compare-contrast activity if the book they've read has at some point been turned into a film. So students watch the film and then compare the book and the film to see what's the same and what's different. Students can also comment on which they liked better, the book or the film. A final activity that you can have students complete with literature and graded reading is to have them form a reading club or a book club. Book clubs are really popular now, even for native speakers of English. Book clubs allow people who've read the same book to get together and discuss their impressions of the book and what they liked and what they didn't like. So your students can have a book club that meets once every week or once every 2 weeks or even once a month. And every student has read the same book, and then they can share their thoughts on what they've read. This is not the end of the story, excuse the pun, I couldn't resist, on using literature and graded readers to teach your students reading. I've given you 2 more resources to look at to get more ideas for extensive and intensive reading to do with your students when they're using literature and graded readers. So I'd encourage you to have a look at these for more ideas. Literature and graded readers are a wonderful source of language for our students. They provide students with an interesting, enjoyable, and motivating way to learn the English language. I would strongly encourage you to find different ways to integrate literature and graded readers into your lessons and into your overall curriculum. So best of luck with this.